January 7, 2026, North Atlantic, 0600 hours. Before dawn, the ocean was a mirror of slate and iron. Cold wind whipped the decks of a U.S. Navy destroyer as it cut through rolling swells, the horizon a low, gray smudge. Radar blipped with dots representing merchant traffic, but the tension aboard was anything but routine. Somewhere ahead, vague, distant, and defiant, was the Marinera, a Russian-flagged oil tanker carrying crude tied to Venezuela's vast reserves. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reyes peered through binoculars into the dim pre-dawn. "There," she said, voice steady, though everyone knew what it meant, a sanctioned vessel refusing to alter course. Nearby, a helicopter's rotors thumped like a heartbeat, ready to lower boarding teams, Marines prepared to seize a ship and its oil cargo under orders from Washington. By mid-morning, the Marinera was stopped, boarded, and claimed. This was no distant headline, this was action. U.S. forces took physical control of a vessel accused of violating sanctions by carrying Venezuelan crude, a move that risked direct confrontation with Moscow and rattled creaking regional nerves. The Marinera was the fifth tanker intercepted in as many weeks, and its seizure was part of a broader U.S. campaign that had evolved from paperwork-heavy financial penalties into kinetic enforcement on the high seas. In the Caribbean, another vessel, the Olena, was targeted. Marines rappelled from helicopters onto its deck while Venezuelan oil tankers loomed in the distance, loath to defy U.S. forces. This wasn't abstract politics. It was oil, America's energy lifeblood and the largest single export in Venezuela's economy. And it was now becoming a flashpoint where economic policy, naval power, and presidential will collided. Just days earlier, January 3, 2026, U.S. forces had conducted a bold raid inside Venezuela's capital, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and announcing a transition of governance rooted in U.S. strategy. What began as an intensified sanctions regime, aimed at choking illicit trade, drug trafficking revenue, and ruling party elites, had soon morphed into a maritime blockade and targeted seizures of tankers carrying Venezuelan crude. The mood in Washington straddled triumph and tension. At a press briefing, a U.S. official described the campaign as law enforcement with no safe haven for sanctioned vessels. Yet diplomats in capitals from Moscow to Beijing were watching closely, interpreting these moves as something far more, a decisive American attempt to control a nation's primary strategic resource. For everyday Venezuelans stalled by economic hardship and sparking shortages, the silent oil fields, once flowing with hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, were now emblematic of a crisis with no clear end. Ships labeled Shadow Fleet by sanctions trackers, sailing under flags of convenience, drifted in port waters, uncertain whether to test the blockade or risk seizure. On-board American command ships, sailors glanced often at newsfeeds. Russia condemned the seizures as illegal, insisting its state-owned energy assets in Venezuela were legitimate. China expressed outrage over violations of international law. Caribbean allies braced for energy fallout as Cuba's oil lifelines from Venezuela began to falter under the tight blockade. Here, at the dawn of a new year, a linchpin of global energy, Venezuelan oil, had become a battleground. The first shock was not a declaration of war, but the unmistakable sound of steel hulls pressing forward under orders: intercept, board, seize. Venezuela had long been a pressure point for Washington, but January 2026 revealed just how central it had become. From Caracas to the remote oil fields of Lake Maracaibo, the country's wealth lay beneath the surface, one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. For decades, U.S. policymakers had debated containment versus engagement. Now, the calculus had changed. The stakes were no longer just regional stability, they were global energy security and leverage over nations eager for oil in an era of volatile markets. By the end of 2025, intelligence reports indicated that Venezuela's oil exports were increasingly funneled to nations bypassing sanctions, with clandestine networks running through Russian-flagged tankers, Chinese-backed shipping companies, and Caribbean ports. Every shipment that avoided U.S. control weakened sanctions and strengthened adversaries. For President Donald Trump, this was more than an economic problem. It was a test of American resolve, a chance to demonstrate that sanctions could escalate into physical enforcement. Inside the Situation Room, advisors argued late into December. Secretary of State and Defense Department officials reviewed satellite imagery showing the growing Shadow Fleet, vessels operating under opaque ownership but fully loaded with Venezuelan crude. Every barrel leaving Venezuela unchecked, one official warned, is a direct challenge to U.S. strategy and credibility. For Trump, the message was clear: if diplomatic and financial tools were insufficient, kinetic measures could not be ignored. Geography also played a key role. Venezuela sits at the northern edge of South America, with its northern coastline stretching along the Caribbean, directly intersecting major shipping lanes. The Panama Canal funneled energy shipments toward U.S. allies and markets worldwide. Control of these routes meant controlling not just the oil itself but the political leverage embedded in supply chains. A single blockade or seizure could ripple across markets, raising crude prices, pressuring competitors, and signaling that Washington would act decisively. The Venezuelan government, meanwhile, remained defiant. President Maduro publicly promised to keep shipments flowing, framing the U.S. actions as illegal aggression. Propaganda flooded state media, images of U.S. Navy destroyers juxtaposed with heroic Venezuelan sailors steering tankers through stormy seas. Yet behind the rhetoric, there was tension. Military units were overstretched, and key ports lacked the capacity to defend against a coordinated seizure campaign. Trump's strategic vision, outlined quietly in National Security Council memos, went beyond stopping illegal shipments. The plan was led, sanctions first, interception second, and, if necessary, direct seizure, a graduated pressure system designed to coerce compliance without an outright declaration of war. Economic warfare would be coupled with military presence, drones surveilling offshore terminals, fast attack craft shadowing commercial traffic, and intelligence sharing with Caribbean partners to track flagged vessels. Experts outside the administration noted the historic significance. Venezuela had once been a reliable global oil supplier, now transformed into a high-stakes chessboard. Every tanker, every barrel, and every port became a move in a game with unpredictable consequences. For Trump, the risk was calculated: control Venezuelan oil flows, and you exert influence over energy markets, adversaries, and the political theater of the Western Hemisphere. For observers on the decks of U.S. ships, the reasoning was obvious in real time. The Caribbean waters shimmered under an early morning sun, but beneath, the currents carried more than oil. They carried tension, policy, and the first clear signal that economic tools could escalate into military confrontation. Venezuela had become the target not only because of its oil but because, strategically, it was both exposed and indispensable. By mid-January 2026, the contours of President Trump's Venezuela operation were unmistakable. In the Oval Office, the walls seemed to hum with tension as aides and military advisors laid out the latest intelligence. Satellite images of Venezuelan ports, tanker movements, and even oil storage facilities flashed across screens. Trump leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing. "If they won't comply," he said, "we take it. That's it. No games." The strategy was audacious in its simplicity: combine financial sanctions with kinetic enforcement. What had begun as restrictions on exports, banking, and shipping documentation now extended into physical control of vessels on the high seas. Enforcement was coordinated through U.S. Southern Command, with Navy destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, and Marine rapid response teams positioned along predictable tanker routes. The operation wasn't secret, it was precise. Every seizure served a dual purpose: deprive Maduro's regime of resources and demonstrate the U.S. capacity to act beyond diplomatic language. Trump's advisors argued over optics and legality. Secretary of Defense warned that Russia and China might escalate militarily if tankers were boarded. Trump's response was characteristically blunt: they can send a fleet. We have more ships, more intelligence, and more resolve. Let them try. The president viewed the operation as a display of raw leverage, a public demonstration that sanctions were not suggestions, but enforceable policy backed by military muscle. The first phase of this strategy relied heavily on intelligence networks. Drones patrolled Venezuelan ports, mapping tanker departures. Signals intelligence tracked communications among shipping companies. Satellite feeds monitored oil storage facilities and refinery outputs. The U.S. Navy's guided missile destroyers were stationed to intercept vessels flagged as carrying illicit Venezuelan crude, and Marine teams practiced rapid boardings under conditions simulating stormy seas and hostile resistance. Every seizure sent a message. When the Marinera was boarded, Trump tweeted an unmistakable line of authority: "Sanctions aren't warnings. They're law. U.S. forces will ensure compliance." International media splashed the images: helicopters lowering Marines onto tanker decks, American flags raised amid Venezuelan and Russian insignia. For Washington, these operations were about more than oil. They were signaling the president's willingness to translate economic power into kinetic action. Behind the scenes, Trump also leaned on private energy analysts, tracking market reactions. Each intercepted tanker caused price ripples in Brent and WTI crude futures. Wall Street took notice, but so did Beijing and Moscow, who calculated that U.S. resolve in Venezuela could set precedents for other global energy disputes. It was strategic theater, coercion mixed with spectacle. At the tactical level, rules of engagement were clear: avoid casualties, secure the cargo, and maintain international legitimacy. Boarding teams wore body cameras. Every seizure was documented meticulously. Trump framed the operation not as an act of war but as enforcement of U.S. law and international sanctions. Yet on the decks of the destroyers, sailors understood the tension. One miscalculation, one misfire, could turn this carefully choreographed show of force into an open conflict. By January 15, 2026, it was clear that Trump's approach was working, at least superficially. Venezuelan exports were interrupted, clandestine networks scrambled to reroute shipments, oil tankers hesitated at sea. But the president knew the operation carried risks far beyond the Caribbean. Each seizure brought Russia, China, and regional powers closer to direct confrontation. Trump's gamble rested on a delicate balance: project power decisively, yet avoid the ignition of a broader war. By late January 2026, the operation had morphed into a high-stakes fusion of military maneuvering and economic coercion. Caribbean waters, once dominated by merchant traffic, now felt like a chessboard under constant surveillance. U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers patrolled the northern Venezuelan coastline, while MH-60 Seahawk helicopters circled overhead, ready to deploy Marines to any tanker attempting to defy the blockade. Each movement was calculated, precise, and deliberately visible, a psychological signal to Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing that the U.S. was willing to use force if sanctions alone failed. On board the USS Laboon, intelligence officers monitored encrypted communications between tanker crews and Venezuelan authorities. Every coded message that indicated an attempt to bypass U.S. restrictions was fed directly to command, allowing rapid interception. Meanwhile, Special Operations Forces trained in boarding maneuvers, simulating hostile crews and adverse weather, preparing for situations where diplomacy and warnings would not suffice. The oil itself had become the focal point of conflict. Venezuela's crude reserves, concentrated in the Orinoco Belt, were among the world's heaviest and most coveted. Every barrel that successfully reached global markets circumvented sanctions, bolstering Maduro's regime and funding allies of Russia and China. Trump's plan was to sever that financial lifeline systematically, to turn economic sanctions into kinetic enforcement, ensuring that the flow of oil could only continue under Washington's conditions. Economic warfare and military power intersected in a series of daring operations. Tankers flagged as Russian, Chinese, or under shadow fleet designations were intercepted mid-transit. On one occasion, near Trinidad, a tanker attempting to slip through the blockade was forced to reverse course under the looming presence of destroyers, while drones streamed real-time video to U.S. command. Traders on Wall Street watched these feeds with increasing unease. Crude prices surged as the risk of seizure spiked, illustrating the power of kinetic enforcement to shape markets in real time. Caribbean allies felt the pressure acutely. Cuba, reliant on Venezuelan fuel, began rationing oil supplies, while smaller nations watched the escalating U.S. presence with growing alarm. The economic reverberations were immediate: shortages of refined fuel in ports, delayed shipments to regional refineries, and global market jitters as analysts recalculated supply chains disrupted by America's maritime enforcement. Inside Washington, Trump's advisors debated next moves. Some pushed for public diplomacy, summits and negotiations to avoid escalation, while others argued that any sign of hesitation would embolden Maduro, Russia, and China. The president's response was decisive: maintain pressure, ensure the seizures continued, and let the economic consequences communicate the message. If they think this is just sanctions, he reportedly said, they're about to learn what power looks like. The line between economic strategy and military confrontation was blurring. Every seizure was a message: the U.S. could enforce sanctions physically. Yet the presence of Russian support vessels shadowing the tankers hinted at the dangers ahead. One misstep, a boarding gone wrong, a collision at sea, or an armed response, could trigger a chain reaction. The operation demonstrated that in the modern world, oil was not just a commodity, it was a weapon, a lever, and a potential spark for conflict. As January bled into February 2026, the reverberations of Trump's Venezuela strategy were felt far beyond the Caribbean. Moscow's response was swift and unambiguous. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov condemned the U.S. seizures as illegal acts of piracy, while the Russian Navy began shadowing tankers in the Caribbean, sending frigates and surveillance aircraft to monitor U.S. movements. Reports surfaced of Russian submarines patrolling southern waters, a quiet yet unmistakable escalation, signaling that Washington's actions were under watch, and could provoke retaliation if miscalculated. Beijing, too, voiced its objections. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a rare public statement criticizing the U.S. for violating international maritime norms, emphasizing that some tankers involved were Chinese-owned or insured. Analysts noted that China was quietly reinforcing its financial and logistical support for Venezuelan oil exports, redirecting shipments through alternative channels to undermine U.S. enforcement. Energy markets felt the tension instantly. Crude futures spiked on fears of broader disruption, while regional allies scrambled to hedge against supply uncertainty. U.S. allies in Europe and Latin America were split. Some applauded Washington's assertiveness, framing it as a decisive action against illicit trade and authoritarian entrenchment. Others, particularly in the European Union and the Caribbean, worried about escalation. A senior EU diplomat warned that continued seizures risked turning enforcement into confrontation, and that the region was dangerously close to a maritime standoff. Caribbean nations, heavily dependent on Venezuelan oil, faced immediate economic pressure, rationing fuel, postponing shipments, and bracing for ripple effects on electricity and transport. Inside Caracas, Maduro used the situation to consolidate internal support. State media broadcast images of tankers evading U.S. ships, emphasizing resistance against imperialist aggression. Yet the reality on the ground was stark. Military resources were stretched thin, supply chains were fractured, and every shipment that failed to reach port was a blow to the regime's already fragile economy. Advisors whispered privately that Venezuela could not sustain prolonged confrontation, but public defiance remained the official line. The stakes for Washington were equally high. Each seizure risked direct confrontation with Russian and Chinese assets. Intelligence analysts tracked fleet movements meticulously, noting that any miscalculation could escalate into a tactical clash at sea. Trump and his national security team appeared willing to gamble. The aim was to dominate energy flows, project U.S. power, and force compliance without triggering full-scale war, but the margin for error was shrinking. The atmosphere was tense, deliberate, and cinematic. Destroyers slicing through Caribbean waters, helicopters hovering like mechanical birds of prey, and satellite feeds streaming live intelligence to Washington. Every decision, intercept, board, seize, carried potential geopolitical consequences far beyond the immediate seizure. In these weeks, Venezuela had become not just a target but a proving ground for a new form of American power, a fusion of economic warfare and kinetic enforcement under a single, precedentially directed strategy. By mid-February 2026, the operation had entered a phase that analysts could only describe as dangerously accelerated. Caribbean skies, once routine for commercial air traffic, now hosted reconnaissance drones and patrol aircraft from multiple nations. Russian intelligence-gathering planes skirted U.S. destroyers, while Chinese satellites tracked every tanker movement. Even distant observers noted a subtle but chilling pattern. What began as sanctions and selective seizures had evolved into a layered, high-stakes confrontation, a kinetic chess game where a single misstep could cascade into open conflict. Observers compared the tension to classic Cold War standoffs. U.S. forces had achieved maritime dominance near Venezuelan ports, but Russian naval shadowing and strategic aircraft patrols meant every interception carried the risk of a tactical clash. Analysts in Washington whispered the unthinkable: if a boarding went wrong, if a firefight erupted over a tanker, the conflict could spiral into a regional war, with global allies drawn in and energy markets convulsing. The parallels to World War III scenarios were not abstract. The US, Russia, and China were all projecting power simultaneously, their moves deliberate but increasingly entangled. On board the USS Donald Cook, Lieutenant Commander Reyes observed the tension firsthand. Radar detected a Russian frigate approaching a Venezuelan-bound tanker, while an American drone hovered nearby, streaming live feeds to the ship's bridge. "One wrong move," she muttered, "and this could ignite something none of us are prepared for." Every interception was now a test of nerves as much as strategy. Rules of engagement were strict: avoid casualties, assert control, and maintain legality. Yet with opposing fleets so close, and tankers caught between, the margin for error was vanishing. Meanwhile, Washington monitored energy markets like a second battlefield. Each seized tanker caused Brent crude to spike. Global supply anxiety rippled through Asia, Europe, and the Americas. For Trump, this was both consequence and leverage. Economic pressure reinforced kinetic strategy, signaling that U.S. power extended beyond borders and that control of oil could be weaponized without a formal declaration of war. Yet the same leverage that created influence also invited retaliation. Russian and Chinese planners were reportedly preparing contingency measures, including escort convoys and potential cyber attacks on maritime infrastructure. In Caracas, Maduro's government oscillated between defiance and desperation. The propaganda portrayed imperialist aggression and heroic tanker captains evading American destroyers. Behind the curtain, military advisors calculated the cost of confrontation. Venezuela's forces lacked the capacity to challenge the U.S. Navy directly, and each failed shipment deepened economic instability. Analysts in Moscow and Beijing noted the fragility of the regime, understanding that Maduro's resistance was partially theater designed to preserve leverage in negotiations. By late February, the Caribbean and northern Atlantic waters had become a microcosm of global tension. What started as an enforcement of sanctions had grown into a volatile triad of economic warfare, military posturing, and psychological signaling. Every ship intercepted, every tanker delayed, and every drone flight contributed to a pattern that resembled a slow-motion escalation toward a scenario where a small miscalculation could trigger the kind of widespread confrontation often described in theoretical WW3 scenarios. The message was clear: oil was no longer simply a commodity, it was a fulcrum of power, a test of national resolve, and a potential spark for a conflict that could transcend borders. U.S. forces remained disciplined, but the stakes had escalated. Each tactical decision was now entwined with global strategy, national reputation, and the unspoken threat of direct military engagement. By early March 2026, the Caribbean had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Destroyers patrolled, drones circled, and tankers lingered at anchor like nervous animals. Yet beneath this surface calm was a quiet, ominous tension, the kind that makes seasoned commanders glance twice at the horizon. Every interception, every seizure, every shadowing frigate carried a subtle warning. This was no longer a simple sanctions operation. It had become a test of wills, a deliberate pressure cooker of global stakes. In Washington, the tone of internal briefings had shifted. Intelligence analysts spoke in terms rarely used outside of contingency war planning: red lines, escalation ladders, and point-of-no-return scenarios. Every seizure carried not just tactical implications, but strategic risk. Moscow had deployed additional intelligence-gathering ships. Beijing had quietly warned that further disruption of sanctioned shipments could trigger economic countermeasures. Even neutral observers in the Caribbean noted that oil rationing, delayed shipments, and persistent U.S. naval presence had transformed regional politics overnight. For Trump, the decision was both practical and symbolic. The aim had never been full-scale war, it had been control, leverage, and deterrence. But each action had consequences that spiraled unpredictably. Every tanker intercepted reinforced U.S. authority, yet simultaneously sharpened global attention, increasing the probability of miscalculation. On-board American destroyers, sailors were well-trained, disciplined, and alert, yet even the most precise plan could not eliminate the danger posed by human error, sudden weather, or miscommunication in the shadow of competing fleets. In Caracas, Maduro's public bravado contrasted with private anxiety. Advisors warned that the economy could not withstand extended disruption. Yet any sign of capitulation risked undermining political survival. Behind the palace walls, debates raged over whether to risk confrontation at sea, redirect shipments clandestinely, or negotiate quietly. The Venezuelan president's next moves would be critical, and each was constrained by the invisible but inexorably tightening grip of U.S. enforcement. As the sun set over the Caribbean, the USS Laboon cast long shadows across calm waters. The operational tempo, the surveillance, the intercepted communications, all combined into a tense, almost cinematic tableau. A fleet exercising control, adversaries testing limits, and a world watching as kinetic enforcement intersected with economic warfare. Observers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America recognized the fragile equilibrium. One misstep, one misinterpreted signal, and the entire chain of escalation could ignite broader conflict. The point of no return was not a single moment. It was a slow, inexorable accumulation of pressure, tension, and global attention. In this silence, in these calculated maneuvers, the line between enforcement and confrontation had blurred. Venezuelan oil had become more than a resource, it had become the fulcrum upon which the potential for larger conflict balanced. And as U.S. forces prepared for yet another interception, the world felt the quiet warning: the stage was set, and no one could be certain how far the escalation might go before it broke.